My name is Evelyn Ross, and if there's one thing life taught me early, it's that people will write you off the moment they hear your voice stumble. I was born with a stutter. Every introduction, every classroom presentation, every time I had to speak in front of others, it turned into an audience waiting for me to fail. Teachers grew impatient, classmates snickered, and even relatives whispered that something was wrong with me. I remember being 12 years old, standing in the middle of my English class, trying to read from a textbook. The words wouldn't leave my throat the way I wanted them to. The sound of kids laughing still rings in my ears to this day. That was the moment I realized the world wouldn't hand me dignity. I'd have to fight for it. Growing up in a working-class black neighborhood, survival was already the first lesson. My parents did what they could, but resources were scarce, and opportunities even scarcer. With a speech impediment, doors that were already heavy seemed sealed shut for me. I couldn't smooth-talk my way through interviews, couldn't charm my way into networks. So instead I built my credibility the long way, through work ethic and resilience. I cleaned houses after school, stacked shelves at the corner store, and later worked night shifts at a diner while taking business classes during the day. Every dollar I earned wasn't just survival money. It was an investment in a dream no one else believed I could achieve. There's a cruel irony in how society treats people with stutters. They hear your hesitation and assume it means weakness, incompetence, or lack of intelligence. They don't see the brilliance of your ideas. They only hear the pauses in your sentences. I learned to let that underestimation fuel me. People wanted to think I was weak, fine. I would build strength where they couldn't see it. I studied contracts, I read financial statements, and I absorbed everything about running a business. If my mouth betrayed me, my hands and my mind would never falter. By my mid-30s, I had saved enough to open a small logistics company. It started with just one delivery van and 3 employees, but I had a vision that stretched farther than anyone around me could imagine. While others were content surviving paycheck to paycheck, I was negotiating supplier contracts, building credit lines with banks, and establishing relationships that would pay off years later. Every time I sat at a table, men in suits would glance at one another, waiting for me to trip over my own introduction. But once the paperwork came out, it was my signature they wanted, not my speech. Success spoke louder than my stutter ever could. Of course, success didn't come without scars. I lost friends who thought I was too serious. I lost relationships with men who said they wanted strong women but crumbled when they realized strength meant ambition and independence. And I lost time, so much time, because every step forward was slower for me than for others. But I gained something they didn't have. Resilience carved from humiliation, patience shaped by rejection, and determination that came from proving the same people wrong again and again. When the company began to grow, I hired more staff, drivers, managers, accountants, and suddenly the woman with a stutter was employing people who once laughed behind her back. They had no choice but to respect me now. My stutter didn't disappear, but the sound of checks being signed and paychecks being cashed drowned out the laughter. This is my story. The story of how a mother with a stutter built an empire from nothing, only to be mocked by the very daughter she built it for. And this is the story of what I did when she stood in her grand new home, a home I provided, and introduced me to the world not as her mother, but as a distant relative. By the time my company had become a recognizable name, the one thing I wanted most was to see my blood continue what I had built. I had one daughter, Jade Ross, and for years I told myself that was enough. Jade had grown up with privileges I never even dreamed of at her age. Private schools, designer dresses, the best tutors, vacations I had to work 3 jobs to even picture in my mind. I gave her all of it, not because I wanted her spoiled, but because I wanted her protected from the stings and humiliations I endured. But protection comes with its own risks. Jade grew into a woman who knew how to charm a room with her beauty and confidence. But behind that polish was a girl who never had to fight for a thing. Where I once counted coins for bus fare, she summoned rides without thinking twice. Where I studied financial statements line by line to keep my business alive, she flipped through magazines and fashion blogs, more concerned with how she looked walking into a room than what she said once she got there. Still, she was my daughter. And in my heart, I believed that if I handed her responsibility, she would rise to the occasion. At company events, Jade was always the one turning heads. Her style was flawless, her smile magnetic. Clients and associates would pull me aside to compliment her. "She's a natural," they'd say, mistaking confidence for competence. I let myself believe they were right. Maybe I was too eager to see my reflection in her. Maybe I wanted to believe that even if she didn't have my grit, she would have my vision. The decision to elevate her wasn't made overnight. I weighed it with my board, but the truth was, it didn't matter what they said. This was a family business, and in my mind, family had to carry it forward. I named Jade head of operations. On paper, it meant she was now in charge of overseeing daily business activities. Contracts, staffing, logistics. In reality, it was me testing whether the foundation I laid could actually stand in her hands. When I broke the news to her, Jade's face lit up brighter than I'd ever seen. But her excitement wasn't about the responsibility. It was about the status. She immediately began talking about new business cards, updated office decor, and how she needed to look the part as an executive. I watched her flip through catalogs of high-end furniture for her office before she even studied the first operations report. Stung, but I bit my tongue. I told myself she just needed time to grow into the role. To seal the transition, I made a decision most parents would never dare. I arranged for Jade to have a home of her own, secured through the company as part of her appointment. It wasn't a gift without conditions. It was structured as a forgivable loan. The company would carry the debt, and if Jade proved herself for 5 years, if she upheld her duties and honored the position, the loan would be forgiven. If not, the loan would be called in, and repayment would be her responsibility. I thought of it as a balance. Generosity tied with accountability. In my mind, this was the tool that would keep her grounded. At the handover, Jade walked through that house as if she had designed it herself. Marble countertops, tall windows, a grand staircase that she insisted would make the perfect backdrop for her social media photos. She posed for pictures, already rehearsing captions in her head. I watched from the side, quiet, telling myself that maybe this was just her way of celebrating. But deep down I felt a shift. She didn't see it as a responsibility tied to performance. She saw it as a trophy, a crown placed on her head by default of her last name. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that no matter how she started, the weight of leadership would eventually press maturity into her. That she would learn the lessons of late nights, of payroll crises, of contracts that could make or break everything. I wanted to believe that the house, the title, and the trust one placed in her would awaken something deeper. I couldn't have known then that the very symbols of trust one handed her, the office and the home, would one day be used as stages for the deepest humiliation of my life. When I elevated Jade to head of operations, I wanted the transition to mean more than a title on paper. In my world, leadership wasn't just about the corner office or the glossy business card. It was about weight. The kind of weight that forces you to stand straighter, make harder choices, and understand that every comfort comes with a cost. I knew Jade loved appearances, so I chose to use that very desire as the tool to teach her responsibility. That's when I arranged the forgivable loan for her home. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. I had spent years structuring housing and benefit plans for employees, especially senior managers. I understood how contracts could be written to give someone both opportunity and accountability. With Jade, I wasn't just a mother handing over a gift. I was a businesswoman setting terms. The deal was simple. The company would finance a luxurious home in Jade's name. The loan would be gradually forgiven over 5 years, provided she upheld her role and responsibilities. If she performed well, she would walk away with a home free and clear. But if she neglected her duties, damaged the company, or broke faith, the loan would be called due immediately. On paper it was clean, professional, and enforceable. In my heart, it was a mother's way of balancing love with discipline. The house itself was everything Jade could have dreamed of. A spacious 2-story home with white stone walls, large bay windows, and a landscaped yard that looked like it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. The kind of place that could host parties, business dinners, or quiet evenings that spoke of accomplishment. When Jade first stepped inside, she looked around not with gratitude, but with pride. "Finally," she said, running her fingers along the marble countertops. "A house that matches me." Stung to hear those words. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't say, "I'll prove myself." She just reveled in what she thought she had been owed all along. Still, I held my tongue. I remembered how I felt when I bought my first office building. How it felt to have physical proof of my hard work. Maybe this was her version of that. Maybe this was just her way of celebrating before the reality of the responsibility set in. I chose to focus on the hope that the contract, the terms she had signed without a second glance, would teach her what my lectures never could. Within weeks, Jade began planning a housewarming party. She spared no expense, hiring planners, caterers, and decorators. Every decision she made was about spectacle. The flower arrangements, the guest list, the champagne brand. She wanted the housewarming to be a statement not just to her friends, but to the entire social circle she aspired to climb into. To her, the house wasn't a company asset tied to performance. It was her personal victory, a symbol that she had arrived. I noticed she was spending more time on color schemes than on operations reports. She knew how to coordinate silk drapes with the dining room furniture, but ignored quarterly performance reviews that sat unopened on her desk. When I asked about certain contracts that required her approval, she brushed me off with a laugh. "Mom, relax. This company runs itself." I wanted to remind her that nothing in business ever runs itself, but I swallowed my words. Sometimes silence teaches louder than scolding. In private moments I wrestled with doubt. Had I made the right choice? Was I pushing her too quickly into a world she wasn't ready for? But then I would look at the agreement, the ink of her signature on the loan terms, and remind myself that responsibility was no longer a gift, it was a condition. If Jade chose arrogance over diligence, the consequences were already written into law. To the outside world, it looked like a mother's generosity. A daughter in her new role, moving into a beautiful home, preparing to celebrate her success. But I knew what sat quietly beneath the glamour. A clause, a contract, and a countdown. 5 years to prove herself. 5 years to show me she was more than appearances. And if she failed, the very house she was decorating for a celebration would one day serve as the stage for her public undoing. At the time, I didn't realize how soon that stage would be set. From the outside, Jade looked like a woman in her prime. Pictures of her walking through the halls of our headquarters in tailored suits circulated on social media. She posted glossy snapshots in her new home, standing in front of chandeliers, holding champagne flutes, and writing captions that read like motivational quotes. To her friends, she was living proof that beauty and ambition went hand in hand. But beneath the glow of her curated image, the cracks were already showing. Within weeks of moving into the house, Jade had developed a pattern that worried me. Instead of reviewing operational reports, she spent her mornings at boutiques and her evenings at dinners with people who barely knew her beyond her Instagram handle. She signed off on expense accounts for personal use, justifying them as networking costs. Company credit cards began reflecting charges from high-end restaurants and luxury salons. When I raised the issue in a private meeting, she waved me off. "Mom, this is how business works now. Image is everything. If people see me living like this, they'll respect me, and by extension the company." But I knew better. I had built respect not with parties and appearances, but with contracts delivered on time and employees paid without delay. I tried to remind her that a company's lifeline is its reputation for reliability, not the sparkle of its CEO's wardrobe. She listened for a moment, then rolled her eyes and said, "That may have worked in your time, but things are different now." The sting wasn't in her words, but in her tone, the sharp dismissal of everything I had sacrificed. The staff began noticing too. Drivers complained that requests for new vehicles were delayed because Jade wouldn't approve the budgets. Managers whispered that reports sat unopened on her desk for weeks. Howard Stones, my CFO, pulled me aside one afternoon with a worried expression. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "she doesn't even attend the operations calls anymore. She just sends an assistant." His voice was cautious, but I heard the unspoken message. Leadership was slipping and everyone saw it. At the same time, Jade's social climbing grew relentless. She surrounded herself with a new circle of friends, wealthy socialites, spouses of politicians, people who thrived on being seen. These were not people who cared about logistics or contracts. They cared about wine lists and gala invitations. I saw her less in boardrooms and more in society pages. The daughter I had hoped would strengthen the family legacy was busy auditioning for a role in someone else's spotlight. Her spending habits worried me the most. Every paycheck went toward designer labels, luxury vacations, and parties hosted in the very house she hadn't yet earned outright. She treated the loan agreement as though it were a forgotten piece of paper, never acknowledging the clause that bound her success to her behavior. To Jade, the home was already hers, an untouchable trophy. To me, it was a clock ticking louder with each reckless decision she made. One night, after a particularly expensive charity gala where she was photographed in a gown that cost more than an employee's annual salary, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the company's monthly reports. Numbers never lie. Contracts were delayed. Vendor relationships were strained. And payroll was growing tighter, not because the business wasn't thriving, but because Jade was draining resources for the sake of appearances. My heart ached, not just as a businesswoman watching her company falter, but as a mother realizing her daughter valued social approval more than family sacrifice. I didn't confront her that night. I knew my words would fall on deaf ears. Instead, I kept quiet, the way I always did when my stutter threatened to turn a serious conversation into another opportunity for her to dismiss me. I learned long ago that silence can be a weapon. What Jay didn't know was that behind the image she was so desperate to protect, the foundation beneath her feet was already weakening. To the world, she smiled for cameras and raised glasses to her success. But I could see the truth behind the smile. The company was bending under her negligence, and sooner or later, the weight would break. When Jade first mentioned the idea of a housewarming party, I thought it would be a small gathering, a chance to bring family and a few close friends together to celebrate her new chapter. I should have known better. With Jade, nothing was ever small. Within days of the announcement, I realized she wasn't planning a gathering. She was orchestrating a spectacle. She hired one of the city's most sought-after event planners, the type who specialized in political galas and celebrity fundraisers. Every detail was designed to dazzle. A grand marquee tent would stretch across the backyard, complete with crystal chandeliers hanging above polished floors. There would be a live jazz band, hors d'oeuvres served on silver trays, and champagne towers glittering under soft golden lights. She even secured a valet service because apparently, guests pulling up in expensive cars couldn't be seen parking their own vehicles. I listened as she rattled off the guest list. Politicians' wives, entrepreneurs' daughters, social media influencers who built entire followings on curated lifestyles. Hardly a single name from the core of our company, the very people who kept the business afloat. I asked her about it gently. What about your managers, Jade? The people you're supposed to be leading? She laughed as if I had told a joke. Mom, they wouldn't know what to do in a place like this. This party is about positioning. It's about showing people I've arrived. That word arrived sat heavy with me. I had spent decades fighting to keep the company alive through recessions, supplier disputes, and economic downturns. I had survived on grit, late nights, and sleepless mornings. And yet, Jade thought she had arrived, simply because she was standing in a home she hadn't even earned outright. The weeks leading up to the party were a whirlwind of deliveries and fittings. Expensive floral arrangements filled her foyer. New art pieces were hung on freshly painted walls, and an imported chandelier was installed just days before the event. Each detail seemed less about welcoming guests into a home, and more about staging a performance for an audience she craved validation from. When my invitation arrived, it came in a gold-embossed envelope, the kind typically reserved for charity galas and weddings. My name was printed elegantly on the card. Mrs. Evelyn Ross. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just a formality. Still I held on to hope. I told myself that perhaps during the event, she would take a moment to acknowledge me, to recognize, even quietly, that none of this would exist without the years I spent pushing through humiliation to build a foundation for her. I chose my outfit carefully the evening of the party. A navy blue dress, understated but elegant, with pearls I had bought years ago after signing my first major contract. I wasn't trying to compete with Jade's glamour. I simply wanted to show up with dignity. Natasha Miller, my closest friend, offered to accompany me, knowing I was uneasy about stepping into a room filled with people I barely knew. If nothing else, Natasha said, this will be a memory you and Jade share, a mother seeing her daughter step into her own. But as the date drew closer, I began to notice subtle changes in Jade's tone whenever we spoke. She avoided talking about me in the context of the party. She emphasized how important it was that her guests saw her as independent, polished, untethered from anything that might dull her shine. For the first time, I felt a chill in my chest, a quiet fear that perhaps I wasn't being invited as a mother to be celebrated, but as someone she would carefully place in the background of her performance. Still, I went forward with hope. A mother's hope, blind and stubborn. After all, it was my sacrifices that put her in that house, my company that carried the weight of the loan, and my faith that gave her the opportunity. Surely, I thought, she wouldn't erase that in front of an audience. I didn't know then that the night I expected acknowledgement would instead become the night I would taste the bitterest humiliation of my life. The night of the housewarming arrived like a coronation. Cars lined the driveway, valets rushed back and forth, and the glow of chandeliers spilled through the tall glass windows of Jade's new home. Guests in gowns and tuxedos floated across the marble floors, sipping champagne, laughing loudly, their voices mingling with the sound of a live jazz band tucked into one corner of the room. From the moment I stepped inside, I realized this was not a family celebration. It was a performance. Every detail, from the cascading flower arrangements to the champagne towers, had been curated to showcase Jade as the star of the evening. I entered quietly with Natasha Miller at my side. People glanced in our direction but quickly turned away, focused on greeting Jade, who stood at the center of it all in a shimmering gold gown. Cameras flashed as she posed effortlessly. Her husband Derek Lawson never far from her arm. I waited, hoping she would see me, wave me forward, and give me even the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. Instead, she turned back to her circle of admirers, basking in the attention. Eventually, the event planner tapped a glass to call for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our gracious host, Mrs. Jade Ross." The room erupted in applause. Jade stepped forward with her glass raised high, her smile dazzling. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "This home is not just a house. It's a symbol of what I've worked for, what I've accomplished, and what's still ahead." She paused for effect, letting the words settle into the crowd like honey. Then it happened. A woman standing near me, curious, asked Jade, "And who is this lovely lady?" She gestured toward me, her voice warm, genuine. It should have been the perfect moment for Jade to honor me, to say, "This is my mother, the woman who made all of this possible." My heart swelled for a second, waiting for her words. But Jade's smile didn't falter as she looked toward me. Instead, she gave a casual shrug and said, "Oh, she's just a distant relative who came to support." The words sliced through me like glass. A distant relative. Not a mother who had built an empire brick by brick. Not a woman who had sacrificed nights, health, and dignity to provide this very roof over her head. Just a distant relative, dismissed and diminished in front of the very people who knew my name, knew my face, and knew the truth. The room shifted instantly. Silence spread like a crack in glass. Guests exchanged glances. Whispers rippled along the edges of the crowd. Some looked down into their glasses to avoid my eyes, while others stared openly, their expressions a mixture of shock and discomfort. The band's music faltered for a moment, a trumpet note breaking flat in the air. Even Natasha froze beside me, her hand tightening around my arm as if to steady me. I felt my throat tighten, my stutter threatening to burst out if I dared speak. I could have corrected her, forced the truth into the air. But standing there, I knew that to argue would only give her more power. The humiliation was complete, not because she lied, but because she chose to erase me in the one space where recognition was deserved. For the rest of the evening, I moved like a ghost through the glittering rooms. People avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice me while circling Jade like moths around a flame. She laughed louder, posed for more photos, and poured more champagne. Her performance uninterrupted, as though the knife she had planted in my chest didn't exist. When the night ended, I walked out into the cool air without saying goodbye. Natasha followed me, her eyes sharp with anger. "Evelyn," she whispered, "you can't let her get away with this." I said nothing because I knew my stutter would betray me if I tried to speak. But inside, something colder than anger had taken root. Humiliation has a way of burning itself into your memory, branding you so that you never forget the sting. That night, in the house I provided, in front of people I had once fought to earn respect from, my own daughter reduced me to nothing more than a distant relative. She thought her words had silenced me. What she didn't know was that silence, in my hands, has always been the beginning of power. I left Jade's house that night without a word, the music and laughter still echoing behind me as I stepped into the darkness. Natasha offered to drive me home, but I refused. I needed silence. I needed the stillness of my own company to process the wound my daughter had carved into me. My feet carried me down the street, each step heavier than the last, but my face betrayed nothing. I would not give her or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Inside, though, I was burning. Her words replayed in my head, sharp and mocking. A distant relative. That wasn't just a dismissal. It was an erasure. She had stripped me of my name, my identity, my sacrifices, all to shield herself from the shadow of my stutter. In that moment, Jade didn't just embarrass me, she betrayed me. And betrayal is something I have never allowed to pass without consequence. But anger is a dangerous thing when left untamed. I had built my entire life on learning how to restrain what others would waste in outbursts. My stutter forced me into patience. It forced me to think before I spoke, to act before I wasted breath. That discipline became my weapon. So, while my heart screamed to confront her on the spot, I knew better. Revenge rushed is revenge wasted. When I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't pace the floor or scream into the walls. I went straight to my office, unlocked the cabinet where I kept my most important files, and pulled out the documents that had secured Jade's home. The forgivable loan agreement sat neatly in its folder, my initials signed across every page, my lawyer's stamp pressed in blue ink at the bottom. I had read it a dozen times before, but that night I studied it with new eyes. Clause by clause, I traced the protections I had built in. Jade had signed her name beneath conditions she hadn't cared to read. The loan could be accelerated in full if she neglected her duties, misused company funds, or brought reputational harm to the business. I remembered the dismissive way she scribbled her signature months ago, eager to claim the keys but uninterested in the fine print. She thought the house was hers. She thought my generosity was permanent. But every line on those pages reminded me. I still held the power. 4 hours I sat at that desk, flipping between financial statements, board reports, and Jade's expense accounts. I highlighted every pattern of neglect, the reports she ignored, the meetings she skipped, the company funds she redirected to her lifestyle. It wasn't difficult to find evidence. Her trail of arrogance was everywhere, written in numbers and signatures. My stutter had once made people doubt my voice, but on paper I was undeniable. And I would use that truth the way I always had, as a weapon sharper than any tongue. By dawn my decision was set. I would not confront Jade with tears or speeches she would dismiss. I would not let her twist my stutter into weakness again. Instead, I would let the law, the board, and the very structure of the company carry out what my voice never could. Jade had humiliated me in public. I would dismantle her pride in public. She would lose the very thing she flaunted, a house built on a contract she never respected. I placed the folder back in the cabinet and locked it, my hands steady. The humiliation of the night before still burned, but the fire no longer raged. It had cooled into something harder, sharper, resolve. My silence at the party was not surrender. It was strategy. And Jade was about to learn that when I am quiet, I am at my most dangerous. The morning after Jade's housewarming, I called Howard Stones, my CFO, into my office. Howard had been with the company for years, long enough to know the story behind every contract I ever signed. He was steady, dependable, and most importantly, discreet. When I told him to bring the loan file on Jade's house, he raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. He walked in with a thick folder tucked under his arm, set it down on my desk and closed the door. I opened the file slowly, running my fingers over the stamped pages as if I were tracing the outline of my daughter's arrogance. Howard sat across from me, his expression neutral but his eyes searching mine. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "is there something I should know?" I leaned back in my chair and steadied myself. "There is," I replied. "It's time I stop pretending Jade's behavior will correct itself. She humiliated me last night, Howard. Erased me in front of the same people who know exactly who I am. But more than that, she's been bleeding this company dry with her negligence. We both know it." Howard exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that comes from seeing the inevitable arrive. He opened the folder and pulled out the signed loan agreement. The terms are airtight, he reminded me. She signed without revisions. You have the authority to accelerate repayment if she fails to meet her obligations. He tapped a specific section with his pen. See here. Any act resulting in reputational harm to the company or neglect of duties as determined by the board may trigger immediate repayment. You gave her enough rope to climb or to hang herself. I studied the clause, reading it again and again. Jade thought the house was a crown placed on her head, proof of her arrival. But to me it was a leash. She had signed away her illusion of permanence the day she accepted the keys. And now, after what she had done, I had the right and the power to yank that leash. Howard began pulling financial statements from another folder. We already have evidence, he continued. Expense reports flagged for misuse of company cards. Payroll delays linked to her approval bottlenecks. Meeting minutes showing she skipped essential operations calls. He laid the papers out on the desk in neat rows, building a case brick by brick. If you want to move forward, we don't just have grounds, we have a mountain. I looked over the documents, each line confirming what my instincts already told me. Jade hadn't just disrespected me as a mother. She had disrespected the very company that fed her, clothed her, and gave her this life of ease. She had treated the business like a backdrop to her social aspirations. And in doing so, she had signed her own eviction notice. Howard hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Evelyn, this won't just be a personal blow to her. This will be public. Once repayment is accelerated, she won't be able to cover it. The foreclosure will be visible to everyone and people will talk. Are you prepared for that? Prepared. I had endured decades of whispers about my stutter. I had endured dismissals, ridicule, and exclusion. I had learned that the pain of humiliation can only be soothed by reclaiming control. Howard, I said firmly, the only thing I regret is that I let it get this far. If she wanted to embarrass me in public, she will lose in public. And I will not raise my voice. The paperwork will speak for me. He nodded once, a gesture of both agreement and finality. Then I'll prepare the documentation for the board meeting. We'll proceed by the book. No one will question the legality. As he left the office, I closed the file and sat in silence. Path was clear now. I didn't need speeches or confrontations. I didn't need to beg my daughter for respect. I had the authority in writing, signed in her own hand. The house she paraded as proof of her independence was about to become the instrument of her downfall. I didn't wait long. Within 48 hours of Jade's housewarming, I instructed Howard Stones to arrange an emergency board meeting. The notice went out with no explanation attached, only the time and location. I wanted the weight of uncertainty to settle over everyone before we sat down. By the time I walked into the conference room, every member of the board was present, their faces marked with curiosity and unease. Jade was nowhere to be seen. This wasn't a meeting she would be invited to. I took my seat at the head of the table, my stutter threatening to rise but my resolve stronger. Howard handed me a stack of files. Financial statements, attendance logs, expense reports. Each document was evidence, each page a nail in the coffin of my daughter's arrogance. I cleared my throat, took a slow breath and began. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my words steady, deliberate. We are here today to address a matter of leadership, accountability, and the future of this company. I didn't need to embellish. The truth carried its own sharpness. I laid out the facts. Jade's repeated absences from key operations meetings, the expense reports riddled with personal charges, the delayed payroll cycles directly tied to her negligence. And finally, I described what had happened at her housewarming, The moment she publicly erased me, the company's founder, in front of wealthy guests and influential partners. This isn't just a personal wound, I continued. This is reputational harm. Our name carries weight in this city. When the head of operations mocks the very leadership that built it, it sends a message of instability, of disrespect, of weakness. And weakness, as you all know, is fatal in our business. The room was silent for a moment. Then Howard spoke, his voice firm. The evidence is clear. Under the terms of her loan agreement, we have the authority to accelerate repayment immediately. Jade Ross has violated the spirit and the letter of her role. The board must decide whether to enforce the clause. One by one, the board members nodded. Some whispered briefly to each other, but no one raised an objection. They had seen the decline with their own eyes. They had heard the complaints from staff. They had noticed Jade's absence in critical decisions. Her betrayal at the housewarming was only the final straw. I didn't push. I didn't beg. I let the silence press on them until one of the senior members finally spoke. We agree. The clause must be enforced. The loan is to be called in. Howard immediately drafted the resolution. I watched as each member signed, their pens scratching against the paper like a chorus of finality. When the last signature was placed, the weight of the decision settled over the room. Jade would now have to repay the full loan, hundreds of thousands of dollars, immediately. Money she did not have, money she had never imagined would be demanded of her. Later that afternoon, Howard sent the formal notification to Jade in writing. It was clinical, impersonal, and devastating. The letter stated plainly that her actions had triggered the acceleration clause, and that repayment in full was due within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in foreclosure proceedings on the home. When I signed my name at the bottom of the notification, my hand didn't tremble. I felt no guilt, no hesitation. The humiliation I endured at her housewarming had already burned that out of me. This wasn't about vengeance in the heat of anger. It was about justice, structured in black and white ink, bound by her own signature months ago. That evening, as I left the office, I thought of Jade opening that envelope. I imagined the shock spreading across her face, the disbelief twisting into panic. She had thrown her party in that house, posed in its grand stairwell, paraded it as her throne. Now the walls she had claimed as her triumph would close in on her, letter by letter, clause by clause. The trigger had been pulled. And unlike her performance at the housewarming, there would be no applause this time. Only silence, foreclosure, and the slow unraveling of the illusion she had built. When the letter arrived, Jade didn't open it right away. It was delivered by courier, the company's seal pressed into the envelope. She assumed it was another formality, perhaps financial reports she could skim later or routine paperwork Howard wanted her to sign. She set it aside on the marble console table, choosing instead to finish getting ready for a brunch with friends. Hours later, after the guests had gone and the house quieted, she slit the envelope open with a careless flick of her nail. The moment her eyes landed on the first line, her confidence faltered. Per the terms of your loan agreement, repayment in full is hereby accelerated and due within 30 days. She read it again, slower this time, her hand tightening around the page. By the time she reached the clause about foreclosure proceedings, her knees nearly gave way. For Jade, the house was never alone. It was her home, her trophy, the physical proof of her new status. She barely remembered signing anything the day the keys were placed in her hand. In her mind, contracts were for employees, people who needed rules. She was the daughter of the founder. Rules didn't apply to her. But now, staring at the demand letter, she realized that the fine print she had ignored had come back with teeth. Panicked, she called Derek Lawson, her husband, demanding he come home immediately. When he arrived, she thrust the letter at him, her voice shaking. "Do something," she snapped. Derek read it twice, his face darkening. He was no fool. He knew the housewarming humiliation had consequences. "Jade," he said slowly, "this is legal. This isn't your mother being emotional. She's coming for the house." That night, they stayed up combing through their finances. The picture was bleak. Jade's spending had been reckless. Designer clothes, travel, events, all paid through credit or siphoned subtly from company resources. Their personal savings were thin, most of Derek's income tied up in investments he couldn't liquidate quickly. They needed hundreds of thousands, and they needed it in less than a month. The next morning, Jade began calling banks. She dressed carefully before each appointment, choosing her sharpest blazers and highest heels, hoping appearance might soften the hard lines of rejection. But bankers deal in numbers, not charm. Her credit reports reflected mounting debt and erratic spending. One loan officer put it bluntly, "You're over-leveraged. We can't extend you that kind of credit." Desperate, Jade turned to her circle of friends, the same women she had invited to sip champagne under her chandeliers weeks earlier. At lunch, she confided in them, trying to mask her fear with casual laughter. "It's just a temporary cash flow issue," she said, sliding the subject onto the table like a gossip tidbit. But her friends shifted uncomfortably. They enjoyed her parties, but none were about to hand over their own wealth to cover her crisis. Their smiles grew tight, their responses vague. One by one they excused themselves, offering sympathy but no help. By the end of the week, Jade was unraveling. Derek grew frustrated with her constant panic. "You did this to yourself," he snapped during one argument. "You thought everything was about image. Well, image doesn't pay debts." His words cut, but they were true. The very man she had paraded as proof of her glamorous life was now another reminder of how hollow her success really was. Each day brought her closer to the 30-day deadline. Each failed attempt at securing funds deepened the pit in her stomach. The house that had once felt like her palace now loomed like a prison. Every chandelier, every polished floor, every marble counter reminded her of what she stood to lose. She had built her social identity around these walls, and now they were slipping through her fingers. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Derek had gone to bed, Jade would wander through the rooms in silence. She ran her hands along the walls as if memorizing them. Her reflection fractured in the tall mirrors. For the first time, she understood what she had taken for granted. But regret could not undo signatures. Paperwork had no sympathy. The same home that had been the stage for her triumph was about to become the theater of her downfall. The 30 days passed faster than Jade could grasp. Each failed meeting with banks, each unanswered call to friends, each tense argument with Derek only brought the deadline closer. When the date finally arrived, there was no miracle, no last-minute rescue. She had no money, no safety net. No way to cover the debt she had laughed off as irrelevant when she first signed the loan. The process moved swiftly because everything had already been prepared. Howard Stones filed the necessary paperwork on behalf of the company, and within days, the official notices were issued. They arrived folded in crisp envelopes, stamped with authority, and they were impossible to ignore. The most devastating part wasn't the letter that came to Jade's hand. It was the bold, glaring foreclosure notice posted on her front door. The paper flapped slightly in the summer breeze, its black letters screaming louder than any gossip ever could. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. Neighbors noticed immediately. Some tried not to stare as they walked by, but their sideways glances told the truth. Others whispered openly, standing near their mailboxes and shaking their heads. Just weeks earlier, these same people had parked their cars down the street to attend Jade's extravagant housewarming. Now they were watching her unravel from the curb. Jade tried to rip the notice down as soon as she saw it, crumpling it in her hand like it could erase the humiliation. But she couldn't erase the copies. More notices followed. Certified letters, court filings, all carrying the same message. The house she paraded as her triumph was no longer hers to keep. It was now a case number, a property marked for repossession. Her friends, once eager to bask in her glow, began pulling away. Invitations dried up. Texts went unanswered. Some who owed her nothing simply didn't want to be associated with her collapse. Others who had secretly envied her success now enjoyed the whispers of her downfall. At the very places she had tried so hard to be seen, the brunches, the boutiques, the charity dinners, her name was now spoken with pity or derision. Did you hear about Jade Ross? Foreclosure. Imagine after that housewarming. Derek too grew colder. The strain of her lifestyle, combined with the looming loss of their home, wore him down. Nights that once ended in laughter now ended in silence or slammed doors. He spent more time away, leaving Jade alone in the house that suddenly felt cavernous and hostile. She wandered through the empty rooms at night, each echo reminding her that walls could not protect her from shame. The company employees noticed as well. Rumors spread quickly. Drivers, managers, accountants all heard that the very daughter who introduced herself as their new leader had failed to meet the basic responsibilities of leadership. Some felt vindicated. Others shook their heads at the waste. In the break rooms and corridors, whispers carried. The founder gave her everything, and look how she repaid it. For me, the process was clinical. I did not need to raise my voice or make a scene. The documents, the filings, the signatures, they did the work for me. Where Jade had tried to humiliate me with words, I now let the law humiliate her with actions. Watching her collapse was not a matter of vengeance. It was the natural consequence of arrogance colliding with accountability. The foreclosure was not final yet. Auctions and proceedings would follow. But the notices on her door, the whispers on the street, and the silence from her so-called friends were punishment enough for the moment. Jade's perfect image had cracked wide open, and everyone was watching. The same house that had hosted her party was now the public stage for her downfall. It started quietly, the way reputations often unravel. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. Then it spread like fire through dry grass. The same guests who had toasted Jade at her housewarming now spoke of her downfall with relish. Over wine and dinner parties, they repeated the story. How she had humiliated her own mother in her gleaming new home, only to have that very home repossessed weeks later. The cruel irony made it irresistible gossip. The details twisted as they traveled, but one part never changed. That distant relative Jade had dismissed was in fact Evelyn Ross, the founder of the company, the woman who had built the fortune Jade flaunted. The story was retold with pointed laughter. Imagine calling your own mother a relative, and then she's the one who takes your house back. What Jade thought was a moment of clever erasure had become the hook of every conversation, a permanent stain on her name. Her social circle disintegrated almost overnight. Friends who once filled her home with chatter now avoided her calls. Invitations she had once chased stopped arriving. Even casual acquaintances kept their distance, not wanting to be linked to her humiliation. When she showed up at the high-end boutiques and restaurants where she had once been welcomed, she was met with tight smiles and polite avoidance. The stares told her everything. She was no longer admired, she was pitied. Derek, her husband, bore the brunt of it alongside her, and resentment grew with every passing day. His colleagues whispered behind his back, mocking the collapse of the glamorous life Jade had promised him. He began staying out later, returning home with the scent of liquor on his breath. His words sharper than before. "You wanted this life," he told her one night. His voice bitter. "All image, no foundation. Now look at us." Arguments became routine. Derek accused her of dragging his name into ridicule, of caring more about her Instagram followers than their marriage. Jade, defensive and desperate, lashed back, blaming him for not helping, for not stepping in to save what was crumbling. But both of them knew the truth. This collapse was hers alone, the product of arrogance and neglect. Inside the company, the damage was just as severe. Employees who had once forced polite respect toward her now openly questioned her leadership. They knew the foreclosure was public record, and they had all heard about the housewarming incident. To them, Jade wasn't just careless. She was unworthy of the title she carried. The whispers in the break rooms were harsher now. She called the boss a relative. No wonder she lost everything. The humiliation was relentless. Neighbors avoided her eyes when she stepped outside. Former friends snickered behind her back. Derek grew distant, their home growing colder by the day. Even Natasha Miller, who had always been in my corner, relayed to me how quickly Jade's name had turned from admiration to ridicule. "They're saying it everywhere, Evelyn," she told me gently. She thought she was untouchable, but people won't let her forget what she did to you. For Jade, the walls of the house that once represented triumph now echoed with shame. Every room reminded her of the night she introduced me as a distant relative, and every whisper reminded her of the irony, that the very person she erased was the one dismantling her life. The social world she had built, brick by brick, on shallow appearances had collapsed in a matter of weeks. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. The foreclosure was only the beginning. The true humiliation would come when strangers walked through her home, bidding on it as if it were nothing more than another asset up for sale. The notice went public 2 weeks before the sale, and from that moment, Jade's humiliation became unavoidable. Her home, the marble-floored showpiece she had paraded to her guests as a symbol of triumph, was now listed in bold print among other repossessed properties. Realtors, investors, and bargain hunters marked the date on their calendars, eager to see what treasures lay inside a house once flaunted across social media. On the morning of the auction, cars began lining the street. Strangers walked up the front path with clipboards and cameras, their voices echoing through the grand foyer as they inspected the place Jade had called her palace. They opened closets, tapped on countertops, measured rooms with casual detachment. To them it was just square footage and resale potential. To Jade, it was the slow dissection of her pride. She tried to keep herself composed, but Natasha Miller, who attended on my behalf, later told me Jade's face was pale and hollow, her once glamorous aura stripped away. She hovered on the staircase, watching as people critiqued the very details she had boasted about at her housewarming. "The paint looks dated. These fixtures will need replacing. The backyard isn't as big as the pictures made it seem." Every word was a dagger, each observation tearing another piece from her illusion of perfection. The auctioneer arrived promptly, his tone brisk and businesslike. He stood at the edge of the living room where weeks earlier a jazz band had played and guests had toasted to Jade's success. Now his gavel echoed off the walls, calling the room to order. Bidding began low and hands shot up quickly. Investors smelled blood, and they didn't hesitate. Within minutes, numbers climbed, voices overlapped, and Jade's humiliation deepened with each shout. She had no power, no voice in the process. She wasn't the hostess anymore. She was a spectator to her own undoing. Natasha said Jade's hands shook as she clutched the railing, her husband Derek keeping his distance, His jaw set tight with resentment. For him it was embarrassment. For her it was devastation. When the gavel finally came down, the house was sold. Strangers applauded politely, already discussing renovation plans, while Jade stood frozen, her world crumbling around her. Natasha described the scene to me later, her voice calm but certain. "Evelyn, everyone there knew what this meant. The same woman who called you a distant relative lost everything in front of strangers. Her humiliation is complete. I didn't need to be there. I didn't need to see the walls stripped of her pride, the chandeliers sold to the highest bidder, or the front door tagged with a new owner's name. My work was done the moment I signed the acceleration clause and let the law do what my stutter never could. I had given her a stage for glory, and she had turned it into a stage for betrayal. Now that same stage had become the theater of her ruin. The auction wasn't just the loss of a house. It was the end of the image Jade had built, the end of the story she told about herself. The same society she courted now whispered her name with mockery. She had reduced me to nothing at her party, and the world had watched her reduce herself to less than nothing when the gavel fell. And as Natasha's words replayed in my mind, I knew I didn't need to gloat. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves quietly, on paper and in signatures, until the walls come down and the applause belongs to no one. In the weeks after the auction, life around me settled back into a rhythm, though nothing truly felt the same. The whispers about Jade's downfall continued to ripple through social circles, but for once, those whispers did not sting me. They were not about my stutter, not about my perceived weakness. They were about the daughter who thought she could erase me and learned instead that her arrogance was built on sand. I did not gloat. I did not call her to remind her of what she had done to me. There was no satisfaction in rubbing salt into the wound. The wound was loud enough on its own. Every time Jade drove past that house, or rather what used to be her house, she saw strangers pulling into the driveway, contractors ripping out the marble floors she once bragged about, a new family discussing paint colors in the rooms she had paraded as her kingdom. That was punishment enough. Inside the company, I moved quietly to restore order. With Jade gone, I restructured operations and put capable leaders back into the roles she had neglected. Staff morale improved almost overnight. Clients who had grown wary returned with confidence. The company was mine again, steady and respected, no longer under the strain of Jade's carelessness. It was almost poetic. By trying to distance herself from me, she had only proved how necessary I was. There were moments when I wondered if I had been too harsh, if perhaps I should have given her another chance. But then I would remember the look on her face the night of that housewarming, the way she introduced me as a distant relative to hide her shame. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. I didn't create her downfall. I simply let the consequences find her. Natasha reminded me of that often. "Evelyn," she said one afternoon over tea, "you didn't ruin Jade. You just let her show the world who she really was." And the world responded accordingly. Her words sat heavy in me because I knew they were true. For me, the victory was never about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about reclaiming my dignity without lowering myself to her level. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to curse. I didn't need to strike. My stutter, once the source of ridicule, had taught me the power of silence. Silence gave me patience, patience gave me strategy, and strategy gave me victory. As for Jade, she learned the hardest lesson of all. That pride built on appearances cannot survive truth. That disrespecting the hands that built your foundation leaves you with nothing when the walls fall. And that betrayal, no matter how cleverly disguised at a party, will always come home to roost. I walked away with my company intact, my dignity restored, and my silence sharper than ever. Jade walked away with nothing but the memory of a house she once flaunted and the echo of her own voice calling me a distant relative. In the end, it wasn't anger that destroyed her. It was arrogance. And it wasn't violence that avenged me. It was paper, ink, and the steady hand of a mother who refused to be erased. That was my quiet victory. And it was absolute.